My name is Jeni Chappelle. I'm a freelance editor, and I like working directly with authors to bring their vision of their story out into the world. I think authors are the coolest coworkers and colleagues and clients, and I'm really passionate about helping people one-on-one. So it makes editing a really, I think, a really fulfilling experience for me. What gave me the idea of doing this particular webinar is that I know a lot of writers who have a lot of knowledge. They've read all the craft books, they listen to podcasts and read blogs, they're part of writing communities. But sometimes it's really hard to apply that information to your own writing, right? So writing is one of those things you have to learn by doing. And then revising is really like that too. So nobody just walks into revisions knowing exactly what to do. But this is the place, revising is the place where all of those craft resources really come into effect. All of those craft books, the podcasts, the websites, the Twitter threads, revising is really the best place to apply all of that. Because when you're drafting, you're creating the story and the characters, the whole world, really, even when it's our world, because you still need it to feel real. It's honestly asking too much of yourself to also get in all of these storytelling elements while you draft. It really takes most authors a few times of working through the whole process from concept to editing before they really even start to apply some of the writing advice that's out there. So I'm really a big believer in messy first drafts and that writing advice is really best applied in revisions. I thought I could hopefully give you some ideas about how to take what can be a really overwhelming, seemingly monumental task of revising 60, 80, 100 plus thousand words of a first draft and look at it from a little bit of a different perspective. So you can hopefully find some ways to move forward with your revisions. We have a problem with revisions, and by we, I mean all humans, in that all of the information about your story, your world, your characters, everything you've created is already in your head. So it can be really difficult when you read your manuscript because your brain starts to fill in any gaps. We kind of do this anyway, even for information that we don't already have in our head. It's how we learn to read, it's how we process information. When you're the one who's created the story, though, it makes it even worse. The more you read it, the more your brain fills in those gaps. So I want to give you a way to approach these revisions so you can make the most of each time you do actually read the whole manuscript. Um, so the biggest question I hear when someone starts revising their first draft is, what am I looking for? I think it's very natural to start by playing with word choice, moving things around, fixing commas or periods that are out of place. But the problem is when you do that, you end up making those kinds of small changes over and over. And then when you send your work to a critique partner or a beta reader, they're going to give you advice about big picture changes you need to make. And if you've already spent time changing all of those little things around, you might end up having done that work when those things are going to be cut. Or they need to change, or you might need to add something else. So it essentially means you're doing double work, or sometimes triple or even quadruple work when you start with those small changes. So in the scheme of things, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and energy, and then you're not going to have to reread the manuscript so many times if you start with big picture changes and work your way down to those smaller details. So the first time you read your first draft, you're going to focus on content. So when I say content, what I really primarily mean is plot and character arcs. This is really the heart of the story structure, how plot and character works together. So that's really the most important thing and what you need to really look at first. Always start with those big picture changes, focus on content. Let's look at storytelling elements. Look at structure work at first and then work our way down to style and flow, and then even further down to spelling, punctuation, grammar, all of those kinds of things. Um, there's just not really much point in worrying about individual scene dynamics, what specific dialogue looks like, if your word choice is what you want it to be, until you know that that structure is really where it needs to be in order for the story to be strong. So you still end up in kind of a position like, okay, great, I'm going to look at my story for content. Fantastic. What does that even mean? What does the actual work look like? What are the practical steps you need to take? So that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm going to try to give you a kind of roadmap for how to approach revising this gigantic, overwhelming first draft and make it something that's a little more manageable to look at those big picture changes. So in your first read through, as you know, you've written a first draft, you've let it sit, rest for a couple of weeks to a couple of months. Letting it rest means not making any changes, not reading it, not looking at it, don't even open the file. If you have thoughts about what you want to change, make notes about that somewhere else. Personally, I like handwriting notes. Just how my brain works. Phone apps can be a great option for this because most of us have our phones with us most of the time anyway. But this resting period is important to give your mind a break from that story for a little while. It helps you gain some objectivity. Sometimes people ask me how long they should let a story rest, and that really varies by person. If you haven't figured out what works for you yet, I say start with a month. In that time, you can work on another story idea, but it's also important to give yourself time to relax. I know what is relaxing. Do as I say, not as I do, okay? Let your mental energy and creativity recharge because writing really takes a lot out of you. So when you do that for about a month, if you approach the story again and it feels like, it's still too fresh, you haven't really gained objectivity, give yourself some more time. Um, Again, this is something you'll figure out the more you go through the whole process of writing and revising. So when you're ready to start making those changes, what do? You have to read it. That's going to be your first step is you have to actually see what you put down on the paper, so to speak. So absolutely, first thing you do, you read through the whole manuscript start to finish. But instead of just reading it, I want you to make notes as you go. There are two different kinds of notes that you'll need to make. The first kind of notes is a scene summary. So at the end of each scene, write down what the page range is. And this is just really for your own benefit, so you can go back and find that easily. So page range, the beginning and ending page for that chapter, the point of view character, if you have more than one point of view in this manuscript, what happens in the main plot. So this is the external goal and conflict, why it matters, which is the internal goal and conflict, how that leads to the next scene, which is sort of the consequences of the character's actions, and then how you address each subplot in that chapter. In terms of format, this can be bullet points. It can just be a couple of sentences, almost like a synopsis. It really is about what works for you. No one else is probably ever going to see this except maybe you're an editor or if you have a really good critique partner. So it's mostly going to be notes for yourself so that you can remember what you're doing and what happens in each part of the story. As a pro tip, next time you write a first draft, if you do this as you go, then it saves you that step of having to do it when you're done. So as soon as you're done with the scene, you just jot down these couple of notes about what happens in that scene. And then it can also help you pick back up when you come back to start writing the next scene. So that's the first thing we're going to do is write down this scene by scene summary. The other kind of notes you're going to make, and you do all this going through that first time, not two different reads, is make notes on everything else you notice. So what do you feel like works? What doesn't work? What do you like? What do you not like? Are there any specific questions that you think a reader might have based on what's actually on the page? So this brings us to an important point. one that's really fundamental to your success as a writer. And that is you have to know what you do well and not just what you need to work on. There's so many times you can look at what you're doing well and then extrapolate that to figure out how to approach the things that need work. So this part, the reader notes, is what's really tricky because this is where our brain fills in those gaps. It's really important to try to pay attention and think as much like the reader as you can in terms of what's actually in the story versus what's in your head. It brings you to a point where you're actively reading and you're engaging more with the story on an analytical level, as opposed to being in the middle of the story and getting wrapped up in everything. It really uses a different part of your brain. And that's why editing skills and writing skills aren't exactly the same thing. And that's also why I feel like a lot of writing advice is better applied in revisions. So at this point, this is all about trying to get that objectivity and see it from a different perspective and get out of the space where all of that story is in your head and you may not know what the reader is actually getting. So there are a few specific issues to watch for that can halt the forward movement of a story, and they have to be handled carefully. So just pay attention to how you are handling them in the story. So backstory is one of those things. Excessive narration or description. All of these can kind of lead to information dumps, just big chunks of explanation being given to us. Flashbacks are another issue that you need to think about and how pay attention to how you're handling it. Transitions are another one. How do you start the scene? How do you end the scene? You want to use that get in late, get out early kind of philosophy so that you're starting as close to the action as you can in a way that makes sense, that the characters are still going to connect and what's happening is still going to make sense to your reader. But we're not going to end up with a lot of setup. So that's a tricky balance. And then you want to get out of the scene before it gets boring or whatever you want to kind of leave it with a hook so that your reader wants to keep going. And then you want to look for a balance on characterization. And what I mean by that is the interior world of the character, their thoughts and feelings versus the external world of forward movement and the plot, action, and conflict. So the balance for those is going to depend on what genre you're writing, what age category you're writing for. It kind of varies based on that. So all of that is technically step one. Read the manuscript, make those two kinds of notes, scene by scene recaps, and then reader notes that are everything else you notice about the story. When I'm editing, I prefer to take these notes in just a old-fashioned spiral bound notebook. Like I said, it's just kind of how my brain works. And then I go back and add them into the manuscript later. This is a personal preference. Some people really like to use margin notes instead. So if you use Word, Google Docs, Scrivener, etc., you can use margin notes. The point is that it's really up to you how you take these notes. Don't be afraid to experiment and try something that feels outside the box. This is a great area where you can, talk to other writers, see what works for them, and try some of those out for yourself and see how you like them. Okay, so that's step one. Step two is to take all of that information you did in your scene by scene summaries and use it to create a reverse outline. Those of you who've worked with me or follow me online probably know that I love a reverse outline. I'm always recommending them to people. And it's because it's such a useful tool. It allows you to see an overview of your story. You get this bird's eye view instead of being mired down in all of the details of the scene by scene. It really helps you get past the point where you're looking at individual word choices and typos and all of those things that happen when you've written thousands and thousands of words. So then when you get all of these scene summaries together, you're going to put them all in this one document. If you're like me, you might put them in a color-coded spreadsheet. I do love a good color-coded spreadsheet. You can also do like Lisa Cron suggests in Story Genius and put each scene on a card and then lay them out to get a more visual sort of reverse outline. It just kind of depends on how you learn, how you process information. And if you haven't done anything else like this before, again, just experiment with it. A reverse outline can be a very standard outline with Roman numerals, like some of us learned back in the olden days for outlining an essay. It can be on little note cards. It can sometimes be a synopsis where there's like one paragraph per scene. It can be bullet points. Again, it's just whatever works for you, whatever feels right, and definitely experiment some with it. So now we've got a reverse outline together. What do we do with that? You have to put all of this information in one place. And you've got something now that's a little less overwhelming than like the thousands and thousands of words. You've got maybe 20 pages to look at now instead of 300 pages to look at, but you still kind of go like, great, now I put it all together, now what? So step 3 is to review your reverse outline and look for problems. Start with plot points and pacing. Most stories follow essentially a 3-act structure. There's also 4-act structure, 5-act structure, 5 plot points, 9 plot points. There's snowflake method and save the cat. So they're really kind of all based on 3-act structure though. But what matters is that whichever kind of structure you're using, you want to make sure that your plot points are more or less falling where you want them to fall. And you may need to move things around some in order for that to happen. So those are the kind of notes you want to take about that. We could really probably do another whole webinar just on 3-act structure. So I'm not really going to go into any details on that right now, but I am going to send you a list of all of my most recommended resources. And one of them is about 3-act structure. I'm also sending you my secret cheat sheet for 3-act structure. So if you're not familiar with 3-act structure, I can help you with some of that. Some plot issues to look for in your reverse outline. External conflict. This is your plot arc. Every scene needs to move the plot forward. Every scene needs to have external conflict. Does everything make sense? Does the plot flow logically from one event to the next? Are there gaps that force the reader to make a leap in understanding? Does your ending resolve the goals that you set out in the beginning? And did you set out those goals in the beginning? It might sound silly, but that's something I see quite a bit in my editing, is that the goals aren't really stated clearly enough in the beginning. And I think that is more common for pantsers than it is for plotters, but this method is for anyone. So you just want to make sure that it is shown in both places. Then in terms of character, some character issues to look for are the internal conflict, which is your character arc. This needs to be clear in every scene as well. Agency is a big one. The main character needs to be the one who's making the decisions that push the plot forward, as opposed to other characters making those decisions. This is, again, something I see a lot of in my editing, that a character doesn't have enough agency, or that they're just sort of being pulled along by other characters who are making the decisions or taking the decisive actions. Is there a strong internal problem? This is sometimes called the emotional wound, that a character has something inside of themselves that needs to be improved upon. They have an obstacle that they need to overcome, just kind of something that's in their way that's stopping them from having what they really want. And then is that problem stated? In the same way I mentioned that sometimes we don't see the plot goals, the external plot goals laid out clearly enough. We also sometimes don't see the internal conflict arc stated clearly enough in the beginning. And then so is that resolved by the end of the story? So those are going to be the main things you're going to look for in your reverse outline. You're basically looking at your plot arc and your character arc. Are you hitting the plot points you need to be hitting? Is the main character pushing the story forward? And is their internal development arc as strong as their external plot arc? Once you have that, you're going to write an edit letter to yourself with all of the notes from your reverse outline and all of those reader notes that you took in the first read through. Start with your strengths. Again, it's really helpful to see what you're doing well. You can extrapolate that, and it also is a kind of validation that is difficult to get from outside sources. So tell yourself, what are you doing well? Then move on to opportunities for improvement. I don't like to say weaknesses because I really honestly don't see it that way. This is an area that you need to address the things in your story that need to change. And you need to give yourself some ideas about how you might go about making those changes. I recommend grouping this by overarching issues. So is that pacing, interiority, action, reaction, etc. Um, and then your third section is going to be like final thoughts and next steps. This is pulling everything together, giving yourself a summary of all the things that you put down with your strengths, and then your areas to improve, and then writing down some ideas of how you might go about making some of those changes. Here I often give my clients a tailored list of resources that they might need. So now you've condensed your story from this giant manuscript into this reverse outline, and then from that into this set of notes. And then we've put all the notes together into a more cohesive form that's a little easier to understand by grouping things together under the main kinds of story element headlines. So then what? Now you've condensed everything down as far as you can. You're going to come up with a plan for your revisions. With a revision plan, you basically have two questions that you need to answer, and they're related. So the first one is, what specifically needs to change in your manuscript? And then the second one is, how specifically are you going to affect those changes? It's really common not to know how you're going to affect those changes, and that's totally okay. Again, revising is one of those things that you have to learn by doing. So now is when you're going to pull out all of those craft books, writing advice, and apply what you've learned. As I mentioned before, I'm going to send you a list of all my favorite resources, the things that I recommend to my clients over and over. At this point, I've typed them so many times that like my fingers just kind of do it without my brain actually telling them to. So those resources, you'll be able to help once you come up with this revision plan. So let's recap. We start with a mindset check. Don't try to do everything right away while you're drafting. And writing advice is better applied in revisions. Then step one is read your story and make notes. Step two, take those notes and condense them into a reverse outline. Step three, take notes on the reverse outline, and then write an edit letter based on those notes and the reader notes from step one. And then step four, write that edit letter, use that edit letter, I'm sorry, to come up with a plan for your revisions. Then it's time for you to actually do the revisions. And I think that's a little different for each person based on how many stories you've already revised, things you've learned along the way about yourself and your process, different pieces of information you've picked up along the way. Every writer I know is really good at one or two of the big things and needs to work on all the rest of them. So whatever works for you in terms of revising, now's the time to do the thing. So I want to touch a little on what happens beyond the second draft. Once you get that first big revision done, this is the time to send it to critique partners and authenticity readers. You really want to get that kind of feedback in early in the developmental process. You don't want to wait until you're maybe 5 drafts in to find out that there are major problems that you weren't able to see because your brain is filling in those gaps. But this way you've gone through your own revision first, and you can get feedback from someone else on it. My best tip about working with authenticity readers and critique partners is to ask them questions. Sometimes authors tell me they want a fresh perspective on their story without any kinds of preconceived ideas. But if you can give the reader a little more focused way of looking at your story, then they can give you a little better feedback usually. So Jamie Gold has a great list of questions on her website. Hers are intended for beta readers, but there are these very broad questions that help the reader focus on some of those storytelling elements. I hope you've already got some good critique partners who are kind of at the same place as you in terms of knowledge and understanding of the process. And if not, in my recommended resources, I've got a link to some ideas about how to find some critique partners. So while your story is with critique partners and authenticity readers, the best way for you to keep honing your own skills and keep working on your own writing process is to practice your revising skills. There's a couple different ways you can do this. The best way to level up your own revision skills is to practice reading and critiquing other people's writing. You can go through the same process we just went through, where you're going to make the notes and condense them down, and then write it all up. But also make notes about how you can apply what you're seeing to your own writing as well. So if you see something that someone else is doing, ask yourself, like, is this something I have a problem with? Is this something I do well? Use it as an opportunity to evaluate your own writing as you evaluate theirs. It's really never too early to start working with critique partners. Normally, I suggest starting with a one chapter swap so you can kind of get a feel for, do you write the same kinds of things? Do you have similar styles of writing? Do you have the same level of knowledge, or does your critique style gel with each other? Because those are important things. So critique partners are sort of a trial and error situation. So if you try one critique partner, it doesn't work, keep trying with it, because it really can become a valuable tool. And it really does help you level up your own writing. So other than critique partners, while you're building your critique partner list, you can actually do the same thing with books you love or books that you've been wanting to read. Authors sometimes kind of hate me when I recommend this, because I feel like the best way, which sometimes kind of breaks your heart to do it, but the best way to get to the point where you see what story structure really looks like is to take a book that you love and know really well and read it analytically and break it down into lots of those little pieces. So you want to look at that structure, the plot and character development, and then basically you're going to write that author an edit letter using the same process. Please do not send that edit letter to the author. They don't want to know what you think of their story structure. But outside of just structure and learning to revise better, it can also be really good to help you see that even your favorite stories aren't flawless. There's no such thing as a perfect story. When we approach things analytically, we feel like we could keep revising forever. But then when we see that even these people that we consider to be like literary greats, that their stuff is just so much better than ours could ever hope to be, but even their writing is not flawless. It's not perfect from an analytical standpoint. And if they're not perfect, then maybe it's okay that we're not perfect too. So I think it can be really helpful. You can also do this with movies. One of the podcasts that I co-host, Story Chat Radio, another editor and I watch movies and then discuss the storytelling elements in them. And what works really great about movies is that they're so much faster than books. You can watch a movie in like an hour and a half to 2.5 hours, as opposed to reading a book, which might be 8 to 25 hours, depending on how long the book is. So you can pack everything into a much shorter period of time. And it just really allows you to keep practicing when you do this, where you're taking other forms of storytelling and condensing them down the same way. So really any kind of storytelling can be approached in the same kind of way. The other thing that's great to do while you're waiting to get your feedback is to keep learning. It's a great time for you to read more craft books. I know I keep saying podcasts. I have a list of good podcasts to listen to as well. Reach out to the writing community, ask your questions, talk to other writers. It's a really great time for you to be thinking about, how can I start making some of this work for my writing as well? So once you get your feedback from your readers, you have to determine what to apply, which again, I feel like that could be a whole other webinar just by itself. So we're not really going to get into that here. But once you've finished those content revisions, I'd like to say it would only be one revision, but it probably won't be. There's not any set number of times of how many revisions you'll have to do in order to get the content right. But what helps is if you're focused on the content, you might not necessarily have to completely reread the whole manuscript each time you do a revision on it. Sometimes you can just work from those reverse outlines instead of having to reread the story, the actual words over and over again. And that keeps your brain more objective on it. So once you feel good about the content, then you want to move on to flow and style. This is the equivalent of a line edit. You're going to work word to word, sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph, scene to scene, chapter to chapter, and just make sure everything is flowing the way you want it to, everything like that. This is, I think, what a lot of writers think of when they think of revising. But in the long run, I think you'll be sorry if you skip the content part of it first. Then once you get another round of feedback on that and you make those revisions, the last thing you're going to look at is spelling, grammar, punctuation. If you're planning to query, chances are you don't really need to pay someone for a proofread or a copy edit. A lot of times this is a good time to get help from like that friend who's like an English teacher, and they've offered to help with your manuscript, or using an app like Grammarly or Pro Writing Aid. Those can be really great resources to get your story into a mostly good shape, so that it's, an agent doesn't really expect to see like a perfectly pristine manuscript with 0 errors in it. Just be careful with those apps because sometimes they, humans really are better at this. So sometimes the apps, don't always catch everything, or they might even sometimes tell you things that are wrong. So just be thoughtful about them. So I'm just going to kind of recap everything I've covered. Writing really is revising. Your brain will fill in gaps that readers will catch. With revisions, you want to start big and work your way down to small. You want to use this method to write yourself an edit letter. And then you want to work on flow, style, etc., and move your way down to typos and grammar. So I really hope that this is giving you some helpful ways of looking at how you approach your revisions, and that some of these tips, like even if everything isn't totally new to you, hopefully some of this is, and hopefully it will kind of give you something that you can take into your own writing process. I'm a big advocate for taking what resonates and bringing that into your writing process. I call that Frankensteining, that we're kind of Frankensteining the processes together that works for us. So I hope you've learned something here that you can Frankenstein into your process. So I want to thank everybody again for joining me. And again, I really hope that this was helpful to you. I'm going to be sending this out as a link for you to watch again, and then you'll get that list of resources as well. So good luck, happy revising, and keep me posted with the progress on your stories.